They say accidents happen, but not when you're the only black student in the room. For Tony Adams, the truth didn't just arrive late. It had to fight its way through a wall of doubt and privilege just to be heard. He was 21, a dreamer, a son from an ordinary family who turned his hunger for art into a scholarship, a key to doors most people like him never even get to knock on. Every day, he walked the marble halls of Crestmont University, surrounded by bright futures and quiet whispers. He was always learning, always proving, always trying to blend in without disappearing, until the day a single sound shattered more than just glass. One moment, Tony was a promising student, sketching beauty. The next, he was a suspect, a headline waiting to happen. His name is Tony Adams. And in a system that often mistakes skin color for guilt and silence for grace, his story is a brutal reminder. Sometimes, innocence has to be recorded before it's ever believed. If this makes you uneasy, good. If it makes your heart ache, hold on to that. Because this isn't just about a broken sculpture. It's about how easily we break people. You're listening to Speak Black, the voice for the stories they tried to silence. So hit that like button, subscribe, and open your heart, because what happened to Tony Adams will change the way you see truth. Before the accusations, before the cameras, before the silence, there was just a boy with a sketchbook and a belief that hard work would make the world see him for who he truly was. This is where his story begins. Before the marble halls and the quiet whispers, before the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, there was a boy who dreamed in color. His name was Tony Adams, and his world was painted in the warm, worn hues of a home that was rich in love, if not in money. He learned early that beauty wasn't something you found in a gallery. It was something you uncovered, like a secret, in the everyday. He saw it in the intricate, sun-faded dials of an old radio his father was always trying to fix, the way the light caught the dust motes dancing from its speaker. He found it in the cracked mirror in the hallway, a spider web of silver lines that fractured his reflection into a dozen different boys, each one a possibility. His greatest masterpiece, though, was his mother. He would sit at the small Formica kitchen table, a stub of charcoal in his hand, and sketch her as she moved through the small space. He didn't draw the faint lines of worry on her forehead, or the tired slope of her shoulders after a double shift. Instead, he drew the graceful arc of her wrist as she stirred a pot of beans, the quiet strength in her posture as she stood at the sink, looking out at the world. He drew the love, because that was the truest thing he saw. "You see the world different, Tony," she would say, looking over his shoulder, her hand resting gently on his head. "You see the good parts." It was his Uncle Miles who taught him how to capture those good parts. Uncle Miles, his mother's brother, was a man who smelled of turpentine and possibility. He was an amateur painter, a weekend warrior with a brush, as he called himself. But to Tony, he was a wizard. His small garage apartment was a chaotic sanctuary of stretched canvases, dripping brushes, and tubes of paint squeezed into beautiful, tortured shapes. It was in that garage, surrounded by the ghosts of Uncle Miles's creations, that Tony received his real education. "Forget what they tell you in school about lines and shading, boy," Miles said one afternoon, handing Tony a battered sketchbook. "That's just technique. Art is something else. It's how we prove we existed. It's how we tell God or the universe or whoever's listening, I was here. I saw this. I felt this. Long after we're dust, the art remains. He taught Tony to see the life in everything. The story in the chipped paint on a park bench. The history in the scuff marks on a pair of work boots. That's our job, Miles would say, his own hands, stained with ultramarine blue, gesturing wildly. To tell the stories that ain't being told, to make people see what they walk past every day. But dreaming in color, in a world that often saw in black and white, came with its own struggles. Tony's classmates, who dreamed of practical things, steady jobs, new cars, mocked his foolishness. You gonna draw your way out of this neighborhood, Adams? One of them sneered in the school hallway, snatching a drawing from his hands. It was a detailed study of a rusty fire escape, each flaking line rendered with care. What's this even for? Nobody's gonna pay you for that. Tony just took the paper back, smoothing the crumpled edges. He learned to build a quiet fortress around himself. His sketchbook, his shield, his pencils, his sword. The lack of resources was a constant battle. He learned to stretch a single tube of cadmium red for months, to use both sides of every sheet of paper, to fashion canvases from discarded wood planks he found behind the hardware store. His mother watched him, her heart a tangled knot of pride and fear. One night, she found him at the kitchen table, head bowed in frustration over a painting for a scholarship application. The colors were muddy. The perspective was off. It was a failure, and he knew it. She didn't say a word. She simply sat beside him, her presence a silent anchor. After a long moment, she said, "Your Uncle Miles says you have a gift. But a gift isn't a free pass, Tony. It's a responsibility. It means you have to work twice as hard to make sure it gets seen." She was right. The rejection letters started to pile up. Polite form letter dismissals from art programs and foundations. Each one was a small death, a whisper that maybe his friends were right. Maybe his dreams were too big for a boy from his zip code. He poured every rejection, every doubt onto the page. His art grew angrier, more visceral. He drew the claustrophobia of his surroundings, the weight of expectation, the fierce, burning hope that refused to be extinguished. And then it happened. The email arrived on a Tuesday. The subject line simply read, "Admissions Decision, Crestmont University." His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He clicked it, his breath held tight in his chest. He had to read the first line 3 times before the words made sense. "On behalf of the admissions committee and the art department, it is our distinct honor to offer you a place in the incoming class. Furthermore, we are thrilled to award you the prestigious Crestmont Horizon Full Ride Scholarship." The air left his lungs in a rush. He stumbled into the living room, laptop trembling in his hands, and could only manage to point at the screen. His mother took one look at his face, at the tears welling in his eyes, and her own hands flew to her mouth. She read the email, her lips moving silently over the words. Then, the dam broke. She pulled him into a crushing hug, her shoulders shaking with sobs of pure, unadulterated joy. "My boy," she kept whispering into his shoulder. "My brilliant, brilliant boy." When Uncle Miles arrived, he was greeted by the scene. He read the email, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. He put a firm hand on Tony's shoulder, his eyes glistening. "See?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you. You'll make them see what we see." The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, proud phone calls to relatives, and a slow, dawning realization that his life was about to change forever. The morning of his flight, he stood in his room, now stripped of his favorite drawings. His suitcase was packed. The house was too quiet. His mother held his face in her hands, her thumbs wiping away the tears he couldn't stop. "You remember who you are," she said, her voice fierce and soft all at once. "You take our love with you. You show them your heart, Tony, and you draw your truth." At the airport, he hugged his uncle one last time. "Remember the garage," Miles whispered. "Remember the stories?" Tony nodded, clutching his old, worn sketchbook to his chest like a lifeline. It was filled with the ghosts of old radios, cracked mirrors, and his mother's love. It was his proof that he had existed. Now, it was his map to a new world. As the plane lifted off, the city of his childhood shrinking into a grid of tiny lights below, he opened the sketchbook to a fresh, blank page. He looked out at the vast, endless sky, the horizon ablaze with the colors of a rising sun. His dream was finally beginning. The dream, from the air, had looked like a promise. Up close, it was a fortress. Crestmont University wasn't just a campus. It was an assertion. Its buildings weren't made of brick, but of aged gray stone that seemed to absorb the sunlight, radiating a cool, centuries-old silence. Lawns sprawled like emerald oceans, impeccably manicured, dotted with students who looked as if they'd been styled for a catalog. They moved with an easy, unthinking grace, their laughter ringing through the quadrangles with a sense of inherited right. Tony, clutching the strap of his duffel bag, felt the weight of his own footsteps. The crisp autumn air, which should have felt invigorating, felt thin, difficult to breathe. His scholarship covered tuition and a single dorm room, a small, stark box that felt more like a holding cell than a home. From his window, he had a view of the bustling student commons, a river of brightly colored backpacks and designer jackets. He unpacked carefully, placing his worn sketchbook on the pristine, empty desk. It looked small and out of place, a relic from another world. The first day of classes was a study in quiet dissonance. He walked into the art history lecture hall, a vast amphitheater-style room with a vaulted ceiling. 100 faces turned, not with hostility, but with a mild, fleeting curiosity that was somehow worse. He found a seat, and instantly, a pocket of empty chairs formed around him, as if he were giving off a frequency no one else could hear. It wasn't a snub, it was a reflex, a subtle, unspoken quarantine. This pattern repeated itself, day after day. In his advanced studio art class, the heart of his degree, the feeling solidified into a cold, hard fact. He scanned the room. 20 students, each with their own easel, their own set of expensive, pristine supplies. 20 faces, and his was the only one that was black. The microaggressions were a language he had to learn to decipher. The awkward, fleeting smiles that never reached the eyes. The way a classmate's gaze would slide over him in a group discussion, as if he were a pane of glass. The subtle shifting of a portfolio bag when he sat on a bench in the hallway. Once, after he offered a nuanced critique of a Baroque painter's use of chiaroscuro, his professor, an elderly man with a tweed jacket, paused, blinked, and said, "That's a remarkably sophisticated observation, Mr. Adams." The surprise in his voice was a tiny, precise needle. He learned to armor himself in silence. He told himself the mantra his mother had given him, the one he'd sharpened in the halls of his old high school. You are here to learn, not to belong. Your work is your voice. Let it speak for you. He buried himself in the scent of turpentine and the texture of gessoed canvas. His sketches became his refuge, the only place where he felt truly solid. It was in this studio, amidst the quiet hum of concentration, that he met Dr. Eris Langford. Langford was different, younger than the other professors, with intense, dark eyes that missed nothing and a restless energy. He taught contemporary critical theory, a class that dissected the politics of art, the unspoken hierarchies of the canon. He spoke about power, gaze, and representation, concepts that vibrated in Tony's bones. One afternoon, Langford lingered after class, stopping by Tony's easel. Tony was working on a piece inspired by Uncle Miles's teachings, a hyper-realistic drawing of his own hands, one holding a charcoal pencil, the other splayed against a page, the lines of his palms rendered with topographic detail. Langford was silent for a long time, studying the drawing. "There's a story here," he said finally, his voice low. "A history. You're not just drawing hands, Adams. You're drawing labor. You're drawing legacy." Tony looked up, surprised. No one had ever seen that before. "Your raw talent is undeniable," Langford continued, crossing his arms. "It's a storm, but a storm can be dismissed as chaos. Here at Crestmont, you'll have to learn to channel it. You'll have to master their language, their techniques, their rules, only to show them how those rules are insufficient." He met Tony's gaze, his expression unflinching, almost pained. "Let me be clear with you, because no one else will be. You will have to work twice as hard, be twice as good, just to be seen as equal. Your work will be scrutinized under a different microscope. They will call it potential or promise, but they will be waiting for you to prove a negative, to prove you don't belong." The words weren't new. They were just the academic, polished version of what he'd always known. But hearing them spoken aloud in this hallowed hall by a man who understood the game made them feel both heavier and lighter. It was a confirmation, not a condemnation. That night, back in his silent dorm room, Tony couldn't shake Langford's words. The fortress of Crestmont felt more imposing than ever. He pulled out a fresh, large canvas and propped it on his easel. He didn't plan. He just started mixing paints, letting his frustration, his isolation, his fierce determination guide his hand. He began a self-portrait. For hours he worked, the only sound the soft scrape of his brush. He painted himself not as a victim, but as a watchful presence. He rendered the familiar curve of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. But he painted the lighting deliberately, dramatically. A single, strong light source from the left side of the canvas cut his face in two. One half was bathed in brilliant, almost harsh light. Every detail was sharp, hyper-visible. The individual pores on his skin, the subtle highlights in his iris. It was the part of him that was on display, scrutinized, seen only for what was visible on the surface. The other half was swallowed in deep, velvety shadow. Not black, but a complex mixture of indigo, burnt umber, and a touch of crimson. In this shadow, his features were suggested, not defined. It held a mystery, a depth, a history that the light could not, or would not, touch. It was the part of him that contained Uncle Miles's garage, his mother's kitchen, the weight of his neighborhood, the quiet stories he carried in his bones. He stepped back, his hands stained with paint, his body aching with fatigue. He stared at the portrait. It was unfinished. It was unsettling. It was true. He was both halves, the scholar in the light and the boy from the shadows. Crestmont only wanted to see the part it could illuminate. But Tony knew, as he stared into the painted eyes of his own divided self, that his survival depended on the part it could not. In the weeks that followed, the divided self-portrait was not an end, but a beginning. It became a key, unlocking a deeper, more urgent language within him. Tony stopped trying to blend in and started trying to carve out a space, not with words, but with pigment and line. His art became his territory, his argument, his sanctuary. He began a series he privately called Proof of Life. It was a concept born from Uncle Miles's teaching. Art is how we prove we existed. One piece was a large-scale charcoal drawing of his father's work-worn hands, cradling a single pristine Crestmont syllabus. Another was a mixed-media collage, featuring a photocopy of his mother's time card layered over a page from a textbook on neoclassical sculpture. The industrial clock punch times disrupting the serene marble faces. His work was becoming a conversation, sometimes a confrontation, between the world he came from and the world he now inhabited. He was translating the unspeakable into the visible. A painting of his own reflection in the window of the student commons, his face superimposed over the students laughing inside, spoke of being both an observer and a ghost. He used color symbolically, the warm ochres and burnt siennas of his home against the cool, institutional grays and blues of Crestmont. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere around him began to shift. The curious glances in the studio turned into longer, more studied looks. The silence that greeted his presence was no longer just empty. Sometimes, it felt weighted with a new, grudging respect. He overheard a classmate refer to him not as the black student, but as the serious one. It was a small thing, a label, but it felt like a foothold. They were starting to see the work, if not yet the whole person behind it. His true peace, however, was found not in their shifting perceptions, but in the deep, silent hours of the night. Long after the last echoing footstep had faded from the hallways, Tony would remain in the 24-hour art studio. It was a different place at night, the air thick with the ghosts of creation. The only light, a single warm halogen lamp angled over his easel. The vast room, with its canvases leaning like sleeping giants, and the smell of drying paint and clay, became a cathedral. Here, there were no microaggressions to decode, no masks to wear. There was only the paper, the pencil, and the truth. It was during one of these late-night sessions, the world hushed and still, that he opened the back page of his sketchbook, a private ledger of his soul. In the quiet, he uncapped his pen and wrote, "When I draw, I don't have to explain why I'm here. The line doesn't ask for my credentials. The shadow doesn't doubt my right to cast it. In the silence of the studio, my existence is not a question. It is a fact." He closed the book, the words a secret pact between him and his art. This was his answer. This was his defense and his declaration. The announcement came at the start of a Thursday morning studio class. Professor Evans, a woman with a severe silver bob and a reputation for impeccable taste, clapped her hands together lightly to get their attention. "Class, a moment. I'm pleased to inform you that next week, we have been granted a private viewing at the Wilkinson Museum of Modern Art. They are unveiling a new acquisition in their contemporary glass sculpture wing, and the curator, a dear friend of the department, has agreed to give us an exclusive tour. A murmur of excitement rippled through the room. The Wilkinson was a temple. It was the kind of place they all dreamed of seeing their work one day. For Tony, it was a universe away from the garage studio and the public library art books he used to devour. "This is more than a field trip," Professor Evans continued, her gaze sweeping over them. "It is an opportunity to stand in the presence of mastery, to understand the dialogue between form, light, and space. Attendance is mandatory, and I expect you all to conduct yourselves with the professionalism befitting Crestmont." The energy in the room was palpable for the rest of the day. Tony found himself genuinely excited. This was why he was here. This was the world of art he had hungered for. He thought of the sculptures he'd only seen in reproductions, the play of light he could finally study in person. That evening, he called his mother. He could hear the familiar sounds of home in the background, the low hum of their old television, the clatter of a pan. "Mama, you won't believe it," he said, a rare, unguarded enthusiasm in his voice. "We're taking a trip to the Wilkinson Museum." "The Wilkinson? The one with the big glass fountain in the lobby?" she asked, her voice warm with pride. "I saw that in a magazine. You're moving in tall cotton, baby." "It feels like it," he said, leaning against his dorm room window, looking out at the illuminated spire of the campus library. He thought of his late nights in the studio, the growing respect in his classmates' eyes, the upcoming trip to a world-class museum. For the first time since he'd arrived, the constant humming anxiety in his chest had quieted. The fortress walls seemed, for a moment, less imposing. "It's starting to feel different," he said, the words feeling both true and fragile as he spoke them. "I'm getting my footing. The work it's speaking for me. I think I'm finally starting to fit in." He could hear the smile in her voice. "I never had a doubt, Tony. I never had a single doubt." Hanging up the phone, he felt a surge of optimism. He looked over at the divided self-portrait, which now seemed like a document of a past struggle. He was building a bridge between the two halves. He was finding his way. He had no way of knowing that the bridge was about to collapse. The museum trip, which felt like the ultimate validation of his place in this world, was not a destination, but a trap. The silence he cherished in the studio was a peaceful one, but a different, more devastating silence was waiting for him at the Wilkinson, ready to shatter the fragile sense of belonging he had just begun to voice. The Wilkinson Museum of Modern Art was a monument to silence. It wasn't the warm, creative silence of the studio. This was a cold, expensive silence, polished to a high sheen and enforced by the vast, white spaces and the vigilant gaze of the guards stationed like sentinels. Sunlight poured through soaring glass walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in sterile air. The floors were a seamless, dark granite that reflected the artworks and the visitors as ghostly echoes, making everyone a part of the exhibition. Tony moved through the halls with a reverent awe. This was it, the inner sanctum. He could feel the presence of the masters in the air, a hum of legacy and genius. His classmates chattered around him in hushed, analytical tones, dissecting brushstrokes and conceptual frameworks with a casual fluency that still at times felt like a foreign language. Tony listened, but he didn't speak. He was too busy absorbing, feeling the art in his bones. Then they entered the glass and light wing. The room was a breathtaking geometric marvel, all sharp angles and soaring ceilings, designed to maximize the play of natural light. And at its heart, displayed on a solitary, illuminated pedestal in the center of the room, was ether. The class gathered around it, a hushed circle. The sculpture was a complex, spiraling form of perfectly clear blown glass, twisting in on itself like a frozen galaxy or a captured breath. It wasn't just an object. It was a manipulation of light, bending and fracturing the sunbeams into tiny dancing rainbows on the surrounding floor. Tony felt his breath catch. This was what Uncle Miles meant. This was proof that someone had existed, had fought with fire and silica to create something impossibly beautiful. His fingers itched for his sketchbook. While his classmates debated the artist's commentary on transparency and form, Tony found a bench a few feet away and opened his book. He wasn't interested in the theory right now. He was captivated by the physics of it, the way the light traveled through the glass, how the curves created pockets of shadow and brilliance. As he settled, a janitor in gray overalls moved past the pedestal, guiding a quiet, humming floor buffer. The machine, wide and placid, drifted a little too close. It connected with the base of the pedestal with a soft, almost imperceptible thump. The janitor, noticing nothing amiss, corrected its course and continued on his rounds. The sculpture, ether, trembled for a fraction of a second, a silent, invisible shudder, and then was still. No one else seemed to notice. The moment was swallowed by the museum's immense quiet. Tony was too engrossed to pay it any mind. He was trying to capture the impossible, the way the light seemed to pour through the glass like liquid. He leaned forward slightly on the bench, his head tilted, his pencil flying across the page. He needed to get the angle just right, to understand how the core of the spiral refracted the light differently from its outer edges. For a moment, everything else fell away. The whispers of his classmates, the weight of being an outsider, the constant self-awareness. There was only the sculpture, the light, and the line flowing from his hand onto the paper. It was a perfect, solitary, artistic moment. A faint, unconscious smile touched his lips as his pencil found the curve he'd been searching for. Then, it wasn't a loud sound at first. It was a sharp, high-pitched crack, like a single note of ice breaking. It cut through the hushed atmosphere of the wing with the precision of a scalpel. Every conversation died. For a suspended heartbeat, nothing happened. The sculpture stood, seemingly intact. Then, with a sigh of surrendering physics, ether collapsed in on itself. It didn't just fall, it exploded into a million crystalline fragments, a violent, glittering rain that cascaded across the dark granite floor. The sound was immense, a roaring, shattering cascade that echoed off the hard surfaces of the room, a symphony of destruction. Silence. Thick, heavy, and absolute. The rain of glass settled. 1,000 tiny prisms glittered like tears around the base of the now empty pedestal. And then, as if pulled by a single invisible string, every head in the room turned. Their gazes, wide with shock, then confusion, then dawning accusation, landed on Tony. He was still sitting on the bench, his sketchbook open on his knee, his pencil frozen mid-stroke. He was the closest. He had been leaning in. He was the one who had been moving. He looked up from his drawing, his eyes meeting a circle of stunned faces. He saw the professor's hand fly to her mouth. He saw a classmate's phone, previously used to take pictures of the art, now pointed directly at him. He saw the security guards, Their previously relaxed postures now coiled springs of purpose, starting to move toward him with grim determination. The world had narrowed to this single, horrifying point. The artistic reverie was shattered, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The air itself felt thick and accusing. For one eternal second, even gravity seemed to judge him. Time didn't slow down. It fractured, much like the glass, into 1,000 sharp, disjointed moments. The first moment was the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps. 2 security guards, their faces set in masks of grim duty, closed in on him. Their previous statued stillness was gone, replaced by a terrifying, focused energy. "You! Don't move!" the larger one barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous silence. The spell broke. Tony stood up, his sketchbook and pencil clattering to the floor. "It wasn't me," he said, the words sounding thin and pathetic against the enormity of the shattered sculpture. "I was just sitting here. It just fell." His words were swallowed by the chaos. Hands grabbed him, firm and impersonal. They wrenched his arms behind his back, and he felt a cold, metallic bite as the handcuffs clamped shut around his wrists. The shock of it, the visceral indignity stole his breath. "Please," he gasped, his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic bird. "Listen to me. It wasn't me." They didn't listen. A knee pressed into his back, and he was forced down. The cool, polished granite of the floor met his cheek. The scent of dust and floor wax filled his nostrils. This was the sensory detail of his humiliation. The hard, unyielding floor. The cold metal cutting into his wrists. The kaleidoscope of shattered glass glittering just inches from his eyes. And the sounds, the whispers of his classmates, a horrified, buzzing chorus. The soft, persistent click-whir of phone cameras, documenting his destruction. He was no longer a student, an artist. He was a spectacle. He twisted his head, trying to find a friendly face, a voice of reason. He saw a sea of wide eyes and parted lips. Some students held their phones steady, their screens a wall of tiny, unblinking eyes. Others had taken a step back, physically distancing themselves from his disgrace. A few simply looked away, unable to bear the sight, their silence as condemning as any accusation. Then his eyes found Dr. Langford. The professor was pushing his way forward, his face a thundercloud of outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is a Crestmont student. Unhand him immediately." The lead guard, the one who had cuffed him, placed a firm hand on Langford's chest, halting him. "Stand back, sir. This is a matter of procedure." "Procedure?" Langford spat, his eyes blazing. "This is a gross overreaction. I am his professor, and I am telling you, you are making a catastrophic mistake." "The procedure," the guard repeated, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register, "is for us to secure the individual closest to the compromised artwork. We will handle this. Step back." For a single searing moment, Tony saw the furious impotence in Langford's eyes. The professor who spoke so eloquently about power and gaze was now being silenced by its most brute force application. He was powerless against the rigid, unquestionable authority of procedure. It was then that the guard leaning over Tony, the one with close-cropped hair and cold eyes, shifted his weight. As he pulled Tony to his knees, he leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant for Tony alone. "It's always your kind. causing problems. The words landed not like a blow, but like a poison. They confirmed his deepest, most private fear. This wasn't about a broken sculpture. It was about the story they had already written for him the moment he walked into this museum, the moment he stepped onto Crestmont's campus. He was a problem, a statistic, a stereotype made flesh. All the fight drained out of him. The pleas died in his throat. The cold from the floor seeped through his clothes and into his bones. He felt the stares of his classmates and the unblinking lenses of their phones like physical weights, crushing him. He was a specimen, pinned and labeled. The boy from the modest home, the hard worker, the scholarship student, the artist. All of it was erased, replaced by this single, devastating image. A black boy in handcuffs on a museum floor. A hot tear escaped, tracing a path through the dust on his cheek before falling onto the cold stone. Then another. He didn't sob. He simply shut down, his head bowing under the immense invisible weight. The world became a blur of sound and light and shame. In the dark, silent theater of his mind, a terrible thought flickered. He had dreamt of making headlines one day, of his name being known in galleries and art journals, his work speaking to the world. He had dreamt of making headlines one day, just not like this. The hours that followed were a blur of sterile rooms and stern faces. Tony was led away from the museum, not in a blaze of glory, but in the back of a campus security vehicle, his wrists still bearing the ghost of the handcuffs. He was processed in a small, windowless office, his name, his student ID, his story taken down with bureaucratic detachment. He repeated his truth like a mantra, his voice hollow. I didn't touch it. I was just sketching. It fell on its own. They released him pending a full investigation, but the words felt empty. Freedom, when it came, was just a different kind of confinement. Walking back to his dorm was like moving through a viscous, hostile atmosphere. Whispers trailed him like ghosts. Students he'd never met stared openly, then quickly looked away. He was no longer Tony Adams, the serious artist. He was Tony Adams, the boy who broke the sculpture. The digital storm broke before he even reached his room. His phone buzzed incessantly, then fell silent as his social media feeds were flooded. A grainy video of his arrest, shot from a classmate's phone, was already circulating. The caption read, "Scholarship student detained after Wilkinson incident." The comments were a gut punch. Always the ones who can't appreciate art. Why do they let them into these places? My dad's taxes probably paid for that sculpture. Hope they expel him. The anonymity of the campus forum was a shield for the ugliest thoughts, and they came pouring out, a torrent of poison that confirmed the guards' whispered words. Your kind. The official email from the university administration arrived that evening. It was cold, formal, and devastating. Due to the serious nature of the ongoing investigation into the damage of significant cultural property, his Crestmont Horizon scholarship was being temporarily suspended, effective immediately. All access to university facilities, including the art studios, was revoked pending the outcome. The final pillar of his dream had been kicked out from under him. Back in his dorm room, the silence was deafening. It was a heavy, judgmental silence, thick with the ghosts of his shattered future. He couldn't cry. He couldn't scream. He could only sit on the edge of his bed, the numbness slowly giving way to a deep, tectonic ache of despair. He pulled out his sketchbook. His hands were trembling. He opened it to a fresh page, and without thinking, his charcoal stick began to move. He didn't draw faces or landscapes. He drew the glass, over and over. Jagged, violent lines, fragments. A crystalline explosion frozen in time on the page. He sketched it with a furious, desperate energy, as if by capturing its destruction, he could somehow understand his own. The pages filled with the ghost of ether, 1,000 broken pieces that mirrored the state of his soul. His phone rang, vibrating insistently on the desk. He saw his mother's picture light up the screen. His heart seized. He took a shaky breath and answered. "Tony, baby, I just saw. A friend from work sent me a link. What is happening? Are you okay?" Her voice, usually his anchor, was frayed with terror. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her it was all a mistake, that he was innocent, that everything was going to be okay. But the words wouldn't come. All that emerged was a choked, strangled sound, the prelude to a sob he was desperately trying to hold back. "Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking. He heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. She understood. She understood the sound of a broken child. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "My sweet boy, I'm coming. I'll get in the car right now." "No," he managed, squeezing his eyes shut. "Don't. There's nothing you can do." The conversation was an agony of fractured sentences and shared, helpless grief. Hanging up felt like severing a lifeline, leaving him more alone than ever. But in the depths of that loneliness, a small, stubborn ember began to glow. Dr. Langford had not been silent. He had emailed the dean of students, the head of security, and the art department chair, demanding an immediate review of the museum's CCTV footage. His email, which a sympathetic classmate forwarded to Tony, was a masterpiece of controlled fury, citing egregious procedural failures and the profound damage being done to a promising student's life and career. A few other students, the ones who had been in his studio classes and had seen his dedication, began to speak up as well. They started a quiet campaign, posting on the same forums that had condemned him, urging people to wait for the facts and remember Tony's character. It wasn't a roar of support, but it was a whisper, a counter-narrative that fought back against the tide of assumption. Sitting in the dark, surrounded by his sketches of shattered glass, Tony finally allowed himself to look at the email from Langford. He read the professor's unwavering words, saw the names of the classmates who had dared to defend him. The numbness receded, replaced by a fragile, aching feeling he barely recognized. It was hope. The truth was still buried, locked away on a hard drive in the museum's security office. It was still being fought for. It hadn't saved him from the fall, but it wasn't completely lost. He looked down at his sketchbook, at the chaotic, painful lines. Then, slowly, he turned to a new page. Maybe the truth still had a voice, somewhere. It was a quiet, desperate thought, but in the heavy silence of his room, it was enough to keep him from shattering completely. The truth did not arrive with a bang, but with the quiet, mechanical whir of a hard drive. It happened in a darkened security office at the Wilkinson Museum, a room smelling of stale coffee and electronics. Around a monitor sat the head of security, a representative from the university's legal department, a stone-faced museum director, and Dr. Langford, who had refused to be excluded. The air was thick with a tense, procedural formality, a world away from the human tragedy unfolding in a dorm room across town. "Let's see what we have," the security head said, his voice neutral. He pulled up the footage from the glass and light wing, the timestamp set for just before the student's arrival. The screen showed the empty gallery, ether glowing serenely under its spotlight. It was a peaceful, almost sacred sight. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Then, a janitor entered, pushing his wide, humming floor buffer. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who belonged in these halls more than any visitor. As he navigated around the central pedestal, the buffer drifted, its edge connecting with the base with a soft, almost gentle bump. The camera, high in the corner, captured what the human eye had missed, a fine, hairline crack, like a spider's thread, snaking up the base of the sculpture. The janitor, unaware, continued on his rounds. The crack was the truth. It was the first domino. The officials in the room leaned in. A low murmur escaped the lawyer's lips. The footage continued. The crack held. The sculpture stood, wounded and unstable, for 43 minutes. Then, Tony's class entered. They watched the students fan out, a flock of bright backpacks and eager faces. They saw Tony break away from the group, find his bench, and open his sketchbook. They saw him, not as a vandal, but as an artist in thrall, his body still, his hand moving with focused grace. He never stepped closer than 3 feet. He never raised his hand. He never made a sudden movement. He was simply sitting there, studying the light, when the inevitable finally happened. The crack gave way. The spiral of glass trembled, then collapsed in on itself in that glittering, devastating rain. The camera's unblinking eye saw it all. The shattering, the panic, the swift, brutal turn of every head towards the one black student in the room. The video played for a few seconds more, showing the security guards storming in, before Dr. Langford finally broke the stunned silence. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. He never touched it. There was no triumph in his statement, only a profound, weary vindication. The museum director sank back in his chair, his face pale. The security head cleared his throat, suddenly unable to meet anyone's gaze. The footage was a perfect, silent witness. It vindicated Tony completely. It exposed the cascade of failures. The janitor's accident, the failure to inspect the piece, the security team's rash judgment, the university's rush to punish. It was all there, in cold, digital clarity. When the news was delivered to Tony in a brief, uncomfortable meeting with the university dean, he felt nothing. No joy. No relief. The weight that had been crushing him for days didn't lift. It simply changed shape, morphing from the pressure of false guilt to the hollow ache of profound injury. The dean spoke of regrettable errors and a full reinstatement of his scholarship and privileges. The words were meaningless sounds. They were trying to put a bandage on a wound that had already scarred over. Back in his room, staring at his own reflection in the dark window, he understood. The truth had set him free, but it couldn't unbreak him. They didn't just break a sculpture that day. He whispered to the ghost of his own face in the glass. They broke something in me. They had broken his belief that hard work was a shield. They had broken the fragile sense of belonging he'd started to build. They had shown him that in the eyes of many, his skin would always be a more compelling story than his soul. But the story was no longer his to control. Someone in that security office, whether out of guilt or a sense of justice, leaked the CCTV footage. It started on a local news blog, then exploded. The grainy, silent film was a far more powerful narrative than the phone video of his arrest. The headline this time was different. Footage exonerates Crestmont student, reveals museum's fatal flaw. The world now knew his name, and they knew his innocence. But as Tony watched the video of his own vindication spread across the internet, he knew that for every person who saw an injustice corrected, there would be another who still saw only a black boy on the floor. The truth was out, but the silence it had to fight through had already left its mark. The truth, once unleashed, was a wildfire in a dry season. The silent, damning CCTV footage didn't just circulate, it dominated. News outlets that had previously ignored the story now ran with bold, shaming headlines. Innocent. Footage reveals racial profiling at prestigious museum. And a sculpture shattered. A student's future almost destroyed. Social media, which had been a river of poison, now turned its ferocious current against the museum and the university. Hashtags like #JusticeForTony and #Crestmonts. Shame trended, a digital roar of public outrage. The institutional machinery, which had been so swift to condemn Tony, now scrambled into a panicked reverse. The university issued a flurry of statements, each more groveling than the last, expressing deep regret, a full commitment to anti-racist reform, and unwavering support for Mr. Adams. The museum released its own apology, citing a tragic sequence of errors. The security guard who had whispered the venomous words and forced the cuffs was summarily fired, a sacrificial offering to quell the public fury. But for Tony, the justice felt hollow, a performance designed to protect reputations, not to heal his. He was no longer just Tony Adams, the artist. He had become Tony Adams, the symbol of racial bias. It was a new cage, just as confining as the last. He was a headline, a talking point, a lesson. The weight of representing an entire people's pain was a crown of thorns he never asked for. His classmates, too, began their reckonings. They approached him in the cafeteria, in the hallways, their eyes full of a new, uncomfortable awareness. Their apologies came in a spectrum of sincerity. Some were perfunctory, mumbled and hurried, a box to be checked off their moral to-do list. Others were tearful, genuine, accompanied by admissions of their own silent complicity. "I should have said something," one girl wept. "I just stood there." He accepted their words with a quiet nod, but the trust was broken. Their faces would forever be part of the mosaic of his humiliation. It was Dr. Langford who channeled the chaos into something resembling substance. He organized a packed departmental forum titled, "Seeing the Unseen, Racial Bias in the Art World." He didn't shy away from the specifics of Tony's case, using it as a stark, painful case study. He spoke about the presumption of guilt and the violent imagination that sees a black body and conjures a narrative of destruction. For the first time, Tony heard his experience articulated not as a personal misfortune, but as a systemic failure. It was a small, cold comfort. A few days after the forum, drawn by a force he didn't understand, Tony found himself back at the Wilkinson. He didn't go inside. He stood outside the glass and light wing, looking through the vast window. The space where ethers had once blazed with light was now a void. The pedestal was empty, cordoned off by a single velvet rope. It was a monument to an absence. He stared at the empty space, his breath fogging the glass. He saw himself in that void, The sculpture had been beautiful, complex, and revered until a single, invisible flaw, ignored by the institution meant to protect it, had led to its catastrophic failure. It had been condemned for a crime it didn't commit, destroyed by a neglect it never asked for. It stood there, just like me, he thought, a profound and weary understanding settling over him. Broken, but still visible, its absence speaking louder than its presence ever did. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed. It was an email from the dean's office, forwarded by Dr. Langford. The subject line read, "Invitation, Press Conference on Campus Equity Reforms." The body of the email was formal, filled with the usual academic jargon. But one line stood out, a simple, powerful request from the organizing committee, which included student leaders and faculty. "We believe it is essential that the student most directly impacted by these events, Mr. Tony Adams, be given the platform to share his perspective, in his own words, should he wish to do so." They weren't just offering an apology, they were offering a microphone. They were inviting the symbol to become a speaker, the victim to become a voice. He looked back through the window at the empty pedestal. It was a warning. But the invitation on his phone felt like a seed. The world had tried to break him, to shatter him into a million silent pieces. But he was still here. He was still visible. And now, they were asking him to speak. He didn't know what he would say. But for the first time since the shatter, he felt a flicker, not of hope, but of purpose. The reckoning was not over. It was just beginning, and it was asking for his testimony. The press conference was not held in a small office, but in the main university auditorium, a space usually reserved for convocations and guest lectures. The room was a sea of expectant faces, flashing cameras, and the low hum of media anticipation. University officials sat on one side of the podium, their expressions a careful blend of solemnity and reform. Dr. Langford sat on the other, a steady, watchful presence. Then, Tony stepped forward. He did not look like the boy from the museum floor. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, settled calm. The frantic energy of injustice had been refined into a quiet, unshakable dignity. He adjusted the microphone, the rustle echoing in the suddenly silent room. He did not have notes. The words he was about to speak were etched into his bones. "They saw a broken sculpture that day," he began, his voice clear and steady, carrying to the back of the hall. But what truly shattered was their illusion of fairness, the illusion that in a place of beauty and knowledge, prejudice would not find a home. It did. It found a home in a rushed assumption, in a whispered slur, in the cold feel of handcuffs, before a single question was asked. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. "The camera didn't just clear my name," he continued. "It exposed a more painful truth, how quickly people decide what guilt looks like. For some of you, my guilt was visible the moment I walked into that museum. It was written on my skin. The sculpture's fall was just the excuse you needed to make the story in your head a reality." He spoke not with anger, but with a devastating clarity that was far more powerful. He spoke of the weight of being a symbol, of the exhaustion that comes with fighting to be seen as human. He spoke of his art, not as a hobby, but as his testimony. "My sketchbook was my only witness before the world had its cameras. It held the truth when no one else would." He ended not with a plea, but with a challenge. "You can reinstate my scholarship. You can fire the guard. You can issue all the apologies in the world, but the real work is to look at the cracked foundations in your own institutions, in your own hearts, and ask yourselves, who else are you willing to break before you bother to look for the truth? The silence that followed was absolute, followed by a surge of applause that was less celebration than it was acknowledgement, a collective intake of breath at hearing a difficult truth spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, Tony did not return to his old work. The experience had remade him, and his art had to reflect that. He applied for a special grant and was awarded it without question. He rented a small studio off campus and began his most ambitious piece yet. He called it Invisible Until Broken. The canvas was large, dominated by a deep, complex background of layered blacks and blues, reminiscent of the museum's granite floor and the shadows that had once swallowed half his face. In the center, emerging from the darkness, was a powerful, life-sized self-portrait. He stood tall, his gaze meeting the viewers directly, his expression one of resilience and unbroken spirit. But the masterpiece was the texture. His entire figure was rendered to look as if it were made of glass, and from his core, a web of golden, shimmering lines radiated outwards, a beautiful, intricate map of cracks, meticulously filled with gold leaf in the ancient Japanese art of kintsugi. He was not hiding the breaks. He was illuminating them, celebrating them, showing that he had been shattered and put back together, and that the repair was now the most beautiful part of him. The piece was a sensation. It was first displayed at a campus exhibition, but its power was undeniable. In a move that sent shockwaves through the art community, the Wilkinson Museum of Modern Art, after a unanimous vote by its new, more diverse board, requested to acquire it for their permanent collection. The day it was installed, Tony stood in the glass and light wing. The empty pedestal was gone. In its place, on a new sturdy plinth, was Invisible Until Broken. The same light that had once illuminated ether now fell upon his own gilded cracks, making them blaze with a defiant, golden light. He was not a visitor here anymore. He was part of the canon. He thought of the journey that had begun with a scholarship and a dream that had nearly ended on this very floor. He thought of the whispers, the cameras, the cold metal, and the long silence that followed. He had traveled through the heart of a nightmare and emerged on the other side, not just whole, but transformed. They said accidents happen. He reflected, a quiet, knowing smile touching his lips as he looked at his creation, standing proud in the institution that had tried to break him. But some accidents reveal the truth. And this time, everyone saw it.